In the middle of a global pandemic, China is flexing its military muscles with India, leading to that one question that's been in everybody's minds for the last several weeks. What is Beijing thinking? What is motivating such military adventurism? And where is this confrontation going? We've heard from many scholars in India, we've been hearing from military generals, we've been hearing from our politicians. It's now time to get a perspective from somebody who understands Chinese polity and Chinese society. I am delighted to be joined live and exclusive on India Today at this time by Gordon Chang. Gordon Chang has lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for more than 2 decades. He's written the book, The Great US-China Tech War. He's even written a book called The Coming Collapse of China, and has a contrarian approach to why China is flexing its muscles not just against India, but against so many countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Gordon Chang, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us on India Today. Welcome. I want to start by asking you about your interpretation of what's motivating China to engage in this border conflict with India at a time when India and the rest of the world, including China, is dealing with a made-in-China pandemic.
Yes, there are many explanations, but the one that I think is the most persuasive is that China is lashing out from a sense of weakness. You got to remember that they've just unleashed the coronavirus on the rest of the world. I'm sure they're very sensitive about that. And what they're trying to do is to change the global conversation away from the coronavirus. And Xi Jinping, I believe, is just lashing out at a number of different countries, not only India, but also South China Sea, East China Sea neighbors, the United States, Kazakhstan, much of Western Europe. So this is part of a broader program, but it's extremely dangerous, because if Xi Jinping faces setbacks, then he very well may believe that he could lose power. His threshold for risk would be extremely low. He is capable of anything.
So when you say that this is a backlash coming from a sense of weakness, can you try and explain, because you follow what's happening in China as closely as you do, can you try and explain what's been happening behind that virtual communist iron curtain after the pandemic and the internal dynamics that you believe are at play at present?
Well, first of all, you've got a Chinese economy which is still in contraction. It contracted in the first quarter 6.8% according to official numbers. Probably this quarter, in reality, I don't know what they'll report, but in reality, it is probably just the deepest contraction, maybe even more. You also got an unhappy Chinese populace because they don't know what a downturn is. And then you have Xi Jinping's policies, which have been producing bad results for China in 2019. That means Xi Jinping has really very few other people to blame because he's got close to total power. And that means that he is responsible. So he needs a victory. And what he sees with regard to India is a possibility of grabbing territory from India and therefore declaring that to be a win for China.
But I'm not fully certain, at a time when most people in China aren't really aware of what's happening at the border because the state-owned media is hardly touching on this story, how does gaining a few kilometers of disputed land in different parts of the India-China border help Xi Jinping, given the enormity of the challenges he's facing domestically?
Well, Chinese people would know more if Xi Jinping's policies were working out well on the border, because then state media, party media would be trumpeting this. I think that essentially what Xi Jinping's narrative would be is that China is recovering lost territory. It's being tough. You see a China resurgent. That would fit into a narrative that Beijing has promoted all along. But then he'd actually have something to show for this. So although it seems perplexing from the outside, this whole notion that China is strong is a very important one for the Communist Party to propagate and for the Chinese people to understand.
You've put out on Twitter saying, India, stand your ground, China will see your strength and back down. Can you explain your advocacy and how you believe India should be responding to this military adventurism from Beijing?
Well, first of all, of course, it needs to reinforce its troops on the border. But I think the most important thing would be to hit China where it really hurts, and that's the economy. So, for instance, canceling contracts of Chinese companies in India is essential. Making sure that Huawei and ZTE, two Chinese telecom equipment manufacturers, are not permitted to provide equipment. I would think rip and replace, take out the Chinese equipment already in your telecom backbone, boycott Chinese goods, make it clear that India is going to impose severe costs on China. China's afraid of India. It thinks it can push India around because it's been pushing India around for many, many decades. But if they see a new attitude, then they're going to take notice and they will treat you with respect. But until you show that strength, China will continue to try to dismember your country.
You know, you're saying that China is afraid of India. Can you explain why you say this? Because you've been tweeting around these lines as well. Chinese officials are afraid of India because they know India is on the way up and China is on the way down. Try and explain your belief about China being afraid of India and why.
Well, China knows that population is the source of power. The Chinese talk about this all the time. And for them, being the most populous nation is important. It shows their strength. They also know in Beijing, and maybe even elsewhere, that the Chinese population is slated to decrease substantially during this century. And also they know that India is going to become the world's most populous state. It very well be on the verge of that. It could also be true right now because China's population numbers tend to be a little bit squishy. That is going to be psychologically very difficult for Chinese leaders and the Chinese people to accept. So they see that the Indian economy is growing smartly. They see the Indian population vastly outnumbering China's. And I think that they're really worried about the strength of India going forward. That's why I believe that deep down, they are trying to dismember India at this time because they think that they've got the advantage now and they've got a closing window of opportunity. Remember, for the Chinese people, population is power, and India is going to have the power this century. China will not.
You also say that when the Chinese try to intimidate, you know they're afraid of something. So try and explain that.
Well, I think right now, just going back into these broader themes of long-term trends, the Chinese are very good at intimidation. They intimidate countries that are much stronger than theirs, especially the United States. But we're coming to a point where I think that the Chinese leaders see a closing window of opportunity. And it's not just demography, where they're going about on the verge of accelerated demographic decline. It's also they can see their economy has reached a high point. Their environment is exhausted. Chinese people are upset. They see restiveness around the world and in their own country. And they also see that the rest of the world is not in a mood to help China because you've got a global economy that will be in a downturn this year. China is still export dependent. And they see factories leaving China for India. So that's why they're trying to intimidate you now, because they believe that they can do so now. They may not be able to do that in 3 or 4 years. And certainly they won't be able to do that in a decade.
You're saying that you feel that the Chinese economy is at its peak, whereas the Chinese government and leaders would like people to believe that they will continue growing for the next 3 decades at the same speed at which they've grown in the last 3. Why do you, Gordon Chang, feel that the Chinese economy could have already peaked?
Well, there's a number of things. First of all, you've got the coronavirus epidemic, which is more serious than the Chinese authorities are letting people know. And we have seen in societies around the world what the coronavirus has done to cause deep contractions. That's also happening in China itself. China has a problem, though, in that its economy is export dependent. And countries like the United States and indeed the European Union are not buying at the rate that they have in the past. And that's because their economies have also been stricken, but it's also because they were now starting to see political barriers to trade. Because of China's aggressiveness, countries are reacting to that. China is overburdened with debt, and we are seeing the consumers not rescue the Chinese economy. The most worrisome numbers for China are the import ones because they show domestic demand. And in this calendar quarter, domestic demand is collapsing. In March, which was the last month of last quarter, imports were down 0.9%. In the 2 months of this quarter, they were down 14.2%, 16.7% last month. That shows an economy in decline. And I think the Chinese leaders understand that they don't have the tools right now to rescue it because they don't have the ability to stimulate like they did in the past. So they know that they're in trouble. And one way to get out of trouble is to cause misadventure abroad. And that, of course, includes the Galwan Valley.
You wrote a highly controversial book called The Coming Collapse of China with Random House. Do you still believe that China will collapse? Why do you feel this way?
Yeah, in 2001, I said it would take a decade, so I'm out of time. The global financial downturn in 2008, I think, gave China the ability to extend its communist system. But, I was wrong about timing. I do believe that China exhibits the same weaknesses today as it did when I wrote the book. And we're seeing Chinese leaders, as I mentioned, in this belligerent, provocative phase, which I think is a sign of a weakness. It's an admission on their part, because they wouldn't be acting this way if they were confident. If they were confident, they would just allow global trends to take their course and dominate the world. I don't think they think that way anymore. So although I was wrong about timing, I still think that Chinese leaders betray a sense of fragility. And that is going to have horrible consequences, not only for India, but for my country and for countries around China's periphery.
But you also say that, typically what it takes is some kind of domestic opposition, a political opposition, only then does a regime change. So do you really sense that high level of angst and frustration amongst the Chinese people? I was in Beijing some time back, and while people don't talk very openly about politics, there was a general sense amongst the punditry in China that as long as they're making money, as long as the economy is growing, people are okay even if some democratic freedoms don't exist, and they exist in India, but they see how things can get done and they tend to make their peace with the communist arrangement.
Yes, but the Chinese economy is not growing right now. It is, as I mentioned, as we can see from indicators, it is still contracting, and perhaps the contraction is becoming deeper and deeper. We've had Chinese people upset in various times during the history of the People's Republic, but it's never really come to anything. Even in 1989, when you had protests in 372 cities in China. But right now, what we have is something we haven't seen before, and that is unhappy people and an economy in decline. And people in China, many people in China don't know what a downturn is. They have no concept of it because they've never experienced one. Well, now they are, and that's eroding one of the Communist Party's primary basis of legitimacy, which is the continual delivery of prosperity. Yeah, China can maintain its political control with its semi-totalitarian system, but at some point that system will break. As I mentioned, I was wrong on timing, but we are seeing real signs of distress in China at this moment.
You also write that the pandemic will change the world much like the fall of the Soviet Union did. What's your sense of how this pandemic will impact China, its place internally, and its place in the world?
Yeah. What we're seeing in China is a downturn, which is unmistakable. We're seeing that downturn around the world. We had a world which was prosperous before the coronavirus. Now it is deep into recession, maybe even worse. What it's done is accelerated deglobalization. And in a world that is deglobalized, we're going to have different winners and losers. When you don't have political barriers to trade, even countries with unsustainable economic systems like China's can prosper because money will come in. That's not happening right now. And I think that we're going to see the market economies and the democracies become stronger on a relative basis. So it's going to be a very different world than was before the disease hit China.
Given the fact that China is messing with Australia, the United States, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, all at the same time, do you see the world getting split into two? China say, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan on the one side, and other countries in the India-Pacific through formations like the Quad coming together as a counterbalance to China?
Yeah, that is already happening before the disease, but of course, COVID-19 has accelerated that. And I think that it's brought into stark relief, for instance, in America, about the fundamental nature of China and the maliciousness of its system. And now you have in America people who are saying, and it's quite reasonable, you're either with us or against us. And that is going to further sharpen the divide. So there is going to be a divide in the world. It's going to be it's going to occur much faster than it otherwise would have. And it's going to bring in very sharp relief the differences between China's semi-totalitarian system and the democracies in the rest of the world.
How do you see China's political leadership and their style evolve from the time of Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, to now Xi Jinping?
Well, what Deng Xiaoping did was he reduced the cost of losing political struggles in China. Under Mao, if you lost a political struggle, you often lost your life. Under Deng and what we saw in his two successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, was basically if you lost a political struggle, you got a big house in Beijing. And that was intended to help reduce political infighting in the party. Xi Jinping has reversed that. He's increased the cost of losing a struggle. So I think the struggles have become more intense. Also, under Deng Xiaoping, you started to see China move to a system where political conflicts were settled according to rules and norms, and it became consensual. Under Xi Jinping, that ended because he grabbed power from everybody else. When you grab power from everybody else, you have not only the power, you also have the accountability, which means that for Xi Jinping, every issue is existential. And that's why I think you're seeing China move in ways that are very similar to that in the Maoist times, and very unsimilar to that in the Deng, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao eras.
So in India, we see a very sharp political cleave, the opposition constantly snapping at the heels of the government. Ordinarily, most people who are watching you at this time would assume that in China, the PLA is one, the Communist Party of China is one, and that they don't have internal fissures. Since you understand their politics in the manner that you do, give our viewers a sense of whether it is as rosy as it actually seems, or do you feel that Xi Jinping is actually being snapped at from within his team inside, even though the rest of the world cannot see it?
That's a really important question. The Communist Party has always been a collection of shifting factions, groups, all sorts of formations of political power. I think under Xi Jinping, he has tried to mute that. But those factions and those cleavages still exist, though they're not as pronounced, they're not as visible. So, for instance, we no longer talk about the Shanghai Gang or the Communist Youth League faction. But what Xi Jinping has been able to do is to quiet that. He's been able to accumulate power, but those cleavages remain under the surface, and they will come back when Xi Jinping falters. And that's why I think he is desperately looking for a victory. If he doesn't have a victory, he's going to have all of those who have been disadvantaged during his rule come back and seek retribution. And so he realizes if he makes a mistake, he can no longer blame other people. He can lose his position. He can lose his freedom. He can lose his assets. He could lose his life. So that's why I think things are much sharper. We won't see this until something breaks, but when it breaks, there'll be events moving very fast.
Now, there are two more questions I want to ask. One, you write about recent waves of uprisings, insurrections, rampages, and bombings. How serious a concern do you think these are? How widespread have they been, given how little about these emerge in the public domain globally?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
No, so the question is about, uprisings, rampages, bombings, especially in, for example, some of the restive products with the Uyghur Muslims, China trying to suppress their voice. How much of an internal pull do you think that is?
Yeah, there's been very few incidents over the last 18 months, and that is because China has gone full Third Reich. They've got concentration camps. People have been put into them solely because of their race or their religion. We know people are dying in those camps. There's been forced labor. And so China has been able to, at least for the moment, prevent those incidents. But what we have, of course, is pressure building up because there is anger under the surface. You know, we saw in last, let's say, 12 months ago, there were a number of protests around China for various reasons, but they didn't, of course, amount to much because Xi just let people blow off steam. So we know that the tensions are there. They haven't gone away because the underlying causes haven't gone away. And in addition to that, we have all of the aggravation caused by the coronavirus epidemic. So you have a restive population, but we don't see manifestations of it because this political system has become far more coercive. And that's really just a recipe for an explosion. We don't know when the explosion will occur, but we do know the pressure is there.
So you're saying that they're building towards an explosion. We don't know when that will happen, but the fissures can be seen. For the time being, Gordon Chang, for joining us and sharing your thoughts on what motivates China and the internal pulls and pressures that Xi Jinping faces. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.